18 Golden Age celebrities who ruined their careers, and no one saved them. They were gods and goddesses of the silver screen. Their faces loomed 50 feet tall. Their names blazed in neon above theater marquees from Times Square to Sunset Boulevard. In Hollywood's Golden Age, these luminaries didn't just make movies. They were living myths, crafting the American dream one frame at a time. But behind the Klieg lights and carefully orchestrated publicity photos lurked a darker truth. These gods could fall, and when they did, they fell alone. The studio system wasn't just a business model, it was a protection racket, revealed a former MGM publicist who witnessed several career implosions firsthand. As long as you made them money and played by their rules, they would hide your indiscretions, manufacture your image, and shield you from consequences. But the moment you became a liability instead of an asset, they didn't just fire you, they erased you. What's particularly chilling about these fallen stars isn't just how quickly their brilliant careers evaporated, it's how completely they were abandoned by the very system that had built them up. Studios that had once dispatched fixers at midnight to bribe police or silence witnesses suddenly couldn't return a phone call. Producers who had fawned over them at premieres crossed the street to avoid them. Hollywood has always operated on a simple principle, explained a film historian who has documented the industry's darkest chapters. Everyone loves a success story, but no one wants to be associated with failure. When these stars began to falter, through scandal, addiction, illness, or simply aging, the entire machinery that had sustained them didn't just withdraw support, it actively distanced itself, as if failure might be contagious. Consider the beloved leading lady who suffered a mental breakdown after years of studio-mandated diet pills and exhausting shooting schedules. When she needed help most desperately, the studio that had profited from her talent didn't send doctors. They sent lawyers with termination papers. Or the matinee idol who discovered that his sexuality would be tolerated only as long as he maintained a profitable facade of heterosexuality. When given the choice between authentic personal happiness and continued stardom, he chose truth and found himself not just unemployed, but unemployable overnight. What makes these stories particularly heartbreaking is the speed of the abandonment, noted a celebrity biographer who has interviewed numerous Golden Age survivors. One day, you couldn't get a table at Ciro's without these stars. The next day, maitre d's were pretending not to recognize them. Hollywood didn't just move on from its fallen idols, it actively erased them, as if their contributions had never existed at all. In the next few minutes, you'll discover the shocking stories of 18 legendary performers who watched their glittering careers disintegrate, sometimes through their own mistakes, sometimes through cruelty or circumstances beyond their control. What unites them all isn't just the dramatic arc of their falls, but the cold reality that awaited them at the bottom. Complete abandonment by an industry that had once worshipped them. But first, we need to understand how the biggest comedian in America, a man who commanded the modern equivalent of $14 million per film, became Hollywood's first sacrificial lamb, and why his destruction established a template that the industry would follow for decades to come.
Haven't I been nice to you? Didn't you have a nice bed last night, and a good dinner, and plenty to drink?
1. Roscoe Fatty, Arbuckle, Hollywood's first major casualty. In September 1921, Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle stood at the pinnacle of comedy stardom. His $1 million contract with Paramount Pictures, over $14 million in today's money, made him one of the highest-paid entertainers in the world. His films consistently broke box office records. His gentle, surprisingly athletic comedy style had influenced everyone from Charlie Chaplin to Buster Keaton, both of whom considered him a mentor. What people forget about Arbuckle is that he wasn't just popular, he was revolutionary, explained a film historian specializing in silent comedy. Despite his size, he moved with extraordinary grace. He could do backflips, pratfalls, and subtle facial expressions that smaller performers couldn't match. Chaplin himself said that Arbuckle was the most physically gifted comedian he'd ever seen. On Labor Day weekend 1921, Arbuckle took a break from his grueling production schedule and threw a small party in his suite at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco. Among the guests was a struggling actress named Virginia Rappe, who became seriously ill during the gathering and died 4 days later from peritonitis caused by a ruptured bladder. What happened next destroyed Arbuckle with a swiftness that stunned even Hollywood insiders. Based largely on the accusations of a single-party attendee who was later revealed to have a history of extortion attempts, Arbuckle was charged with manslaughter. William Randolph Hearst's newspapers turned the tragedy into America's first major media feeding frenzy, publishing wildly sensationalized accounts that portrayed Arbuckle as a monster who had sexually assaulted Rapp with a foreign object. The public reaction was immediate and devastating, said the historian. Theater owners across America pulled Arbuckle's films. Paramount suspended him without severance. Editorials called for his execution. All this happened before a single piece of evidence had been presented in court, before anyone knew what had actually occurred in that hotel room. The most shocking aspect of Arbuckle's downfall wasn't the allegations themselves, which later evidence would suggest were largely fabricated, but the speed with which the industry abandoned him. Colleagues who had profited from his talents for years suddenly claimed they barely knew him. The studio that had trumpeted his contract as a landmark achievement now couldn't distance itself quickly enough. Arbuckle went through 3 trials, noted a legal historian who has studied the case. The first 2 ended in hung juries. The third resulted in a complete acquittal and something more. The jury took the extraordinary step of issuing a formal written apology to Arbuckle, stating, "Acquittal is not enough for Roscoe Arbuckle. We feel that a great injustice has been done him. There was not the slightest proof adduced to connect him in any way with the commission of a crime." This unprecedented jury statement, essentially declaring Arbuckle a victim rather than a perpetrator, came too late. Will Hayes, the newly appointed film industry morality czar, had already banned Arbuckle from appearing in motion pictures. Though the ban was technically lifted after the acquittal, the damage was permanent. No studio would touch him. No producer would hire him. The public had moved on. In the space of 3 months, Arbuckle went from being America's beloved comedian to an unemployable pariah, said the historian. Not because of anything he'd done. 3 separate juries found no evidence of wrongdoing, but because the industry decided he was expendable. They sacrificed him to protect themselves from the moral outrage Hearst's papers had manufactured. Arbuckle eventually found limited work directing films under the pseudonym William Goodrich, but he never recaptured even a fraction of his former success. He died in 1933 of a heart attack, on the very day he had signed a modest contract that might have led to a minor comeback. He was just 46 years old. The Arbuckle case established the template Hollywood would follow for decades, concluded the historian. When scandal threatened the industry's image, individual careers, even the most successful ones, became instantly disposable. No amount of talent, no previous contribution, no personal loyalty would save you once you became a liability instead of an asset.
Of course you are. I'll help you pack them myself. You don't have to leave anything behind. Except your snow people, of course.
2. Judy Garland. The star. The studio system broke. If Hollywood has a tragic princess, it's Judy Garland. From her breakout role as Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz, to her unforgettable performances in films like Meet Me in St. Louis and A Star is Born, Garland possessed a combination of vocal power, emotional vulnerability, and screen presence that remains unmatched nearly a century later. What made Garland unique wasn't just her technical abilities, though those were extraordinary, explained a musical historian. It was her emotional transparency, the sense that when she sang, you were witnessing something authentic and deeply personal. She didn't perform songs. She lived them in a way that made audiences feel they were experiencing her innermost thoughts and feelings. This same emotional transparency made Garland particularly vulnerable to the brutalities of the studio system. Signed to MGM at age 13, she immediately encountered the controlling mechanisms that would eventually destroy her. Studio executives constantly criticized her weight and appearance, putting her on strict diets and providing amphetamines to control her appetite and barbiturates to help her sleep after the stimulants kept her awake. MGM didn't just employ Garland, they systematically dismantled her self-esteem while creating a chemical dependency that would haunt her for the rest of her life, said a biographer who has extensively researched Garland's career. By the time she was 16, studio doctors had her on a daily regimen of pills that would have hospitalized most adults, all while demanding she maintain a grueling production schedule. The combination of emotional pressure, physical exhaustion, and prescribed addiction created a pattern of instability that became increasingly difficult to conceal. By her early 20s, Garland was experiencing mood swings, anxiety attacks, and physical collapses that occasionally disrupted filming. Each incident was treated not as a cry for help, but as an inconvenience to be managed. usually with more medication. The studio's solution to problems they'd largely created was to double down on the very methods that were causing the damage, noted the historian. When Garland couldn't sleep because of the amphetamines they gave her for weight control, they prescribed stronger sleeping pills. When those led to grogginess on set, they prescribed more amphetamines. It was a pharmaceutical death spiral disguised as medical care. By 1950, after 15 years of this treatment, Garland's health had deteriorated to the point that she could no longer reliably function within MGM's demanding system. Following several incomplete film projects and hospitalizations, the studio made a cold business decision. Judy Garland, once their most reliable musical star, had become a liability rather than an asset. They terminated her contract. What's particularly cruel about MGM's abandonment of Garland is that they had created the very problems they were now using to justify cutting her loose, said the biographer. They had supplied the pills, pushed the punishing schedules, demanded the physical transformations that had broken her health. Then, when she could no longer meet their demands, they discarded her as if the damage had been entirely self-inflicted. Left without the structure of the studio system, however toxic that structure had been, Garland struggled to rebuild both her health and her career. Though she achieved remarkable comebacks, including her legendary 1961 Carnegie Hall concert, the pattern of breakdowns, missed performances, and substance issues continued. Each public failure reinforced the industry narrative that she was unreliable, difficult, a bad investment, despite her undeniable talent. The tragedy of Garland's career isn't just what happened while she was at MGM, observed a cultural historian. It's that once the studio discarded her, the damage they had inflicted became her defining characteristic in the industry's eyes. The very problems they had created were now used to justify not hiring her, not supporting her, not investing in her recovery. When Garland died in 1969 at the age of 47, the obituaries invariably mentioned her troubled history, her missed performances, her struggles with addiction, all without acknowledging the systemic abuse that had created these issues in a performer who had been working since childhood. MGM, which had profited enormously from her talent while systematically undermining her health, expressed appropriate corporate sadness without accepting any responsibility. Garland's story reveals the disposability of even the greatest stars in the studio system, concluded the historian. MGM built her up, broke her down, then abandoned her when she could no longer function within their damaging parameters. When she died, they mourned the loss of her talent without acknowledging their role in destroying it.
Let me. Now he'll be asleep in a moment now.
3. John Gilbert, the voice that wasn't. In the final years of the silent era, no male star commanded greater audience adoration than John Gilbert. With his smoldering gaze, athletic physique, and passionate screen presence, the great lover had parlayed his extraordinary popularity into a contract with MGM paying him $250,000 per film, an astronomical sum in the mid-1920s. His on-screen chemistry with Greta Garbo created some of the most electrifying moments in silent cinema, cementing both their statuses as definitive romantic icons of the era. Gilbert wasn't just popular, he was the prototype of the modern male movie star, explained a film historian specializing in the transition from silent to sound cinema. His appeal rested on a particular kind of intense romantic masculinity that audiences, especially women, found irresistible. In many ways, he defined what a leading man could be. This carefully constructed image began to unravel with the arrival of sound technology in 1927. Like many silent stars, Gilbert faced the challenge of transitioning to talkies, films where audiences would finally hear the voices they had previously only imagined. For some performers, this transition proved impossible due to heavy accents, speech impediments, or voices that simply didn't match their established screen personas. Gilbert's situation, however, was more complex and ultimately more tragic. Contrary to popular mythology, his natural speaking voice was perfectly adequate, neither unusually high-pitched nor particularly distinctive in any negative way. What doomed Gilbert's transition to sound was not his voice itself, but a perfect storm of studio politics, personal vendettas, and one catastrophically ill-timed public appearance. Gilbert had committed what was, in the hierarchical studio system, an unforgivable sin, said the historian. He had personally offended Louis B. Mayer, MGM's powerful head. According to multiple accounts, Gilbert had physically confronted Mayer at a party after the executive made disparaging remarks about Greta Garbo, with whom Gilbert was romantically involved. Mayer allegedly vowed revenge, telling associates, "I'll destroy him." This personal animosity coincided with MGM's desire to renegotiate Gilbert's expensive contract as the industry navigated the costly transition to sound production. The result was a perfect alignment of corporate financial interest and executive personal vendetta. Both would be served by Gilbert's professional destruction. The mechanism of this destruction was Gilbert's first major sound film, His Glorious Night, 1929. While Gilbert's voice itself was unremarkable, the film's direction and dialogue were seemingly designed to make him appear ridiculous. He was instructed to repeatedly say, "I love you," to his leading lady in a mannered way that struck audiences as comical rather than romantic. Whether through deliberate sabotage or simple incompetence, the film transformed Gilbert from romantic ideal to unintentional parody. The damage from His Glorious Night might have been manageable with studio support, observed the historian. Other stars recovered from problematic early sound films when their studios invested in better material and more appropriate direction for subsequent projects. But MGM appeared to have no interest in salvaging Gilbert's career, quite the opposite. The fatal blow to Gilbert's already wounded career came at a major Hollywood event broadcast nationally on radio. Gilbert, reportedly devastated by both the reception to His Glorious Night and his deteriorating relationship with Garbo, appeared noticeably intoxicated. When called upon to speak, his slurred words seemed to confirm the growing narrative that he was unsuited to sound cinema. That radio appearance was the point of no return, said the media historian. Americans who hadn't even seen His Glorious Night heard Gilbert sounding nothing like the dashing hero they had imagined. The gap between his silent image and this audible reality was too great to bridge. Literally overnight, Gilbert went from romantic ideal to industry joke. MGM, rather than attempting to rehabilitate one of their most valuable stars, appeared to accelerate his downfall. They assigned him to increasingly inferior projects with limited promotion, seemingly content to let his career die a slow death rather than investing in its resurrection. His salary, once the studio's highest, became a financial liability as his box office appeal plummeted. By 1933, just 4 years after his first talkie, Gilbert was effectively finished in Hollywood. MGM eventually released him from his contract, and no other studio was willing to gamble on a star whose name had become synonymous with the failures of the silent-to-sound transition. The psychological impact was devastating. Gilbert, once the very definition of Hollywood success, sank into alcoholism and depression. On January 9, 1936, he suffered a fatal heart attack at the age of just 38. His death certificate listed myocarditis as the official cause, but those who knew him attributed his premature demise to a broken heart, a spirit crushed by an industry that had built him up only to systematically dismantle him when it became financially and personally expedient to do so. Gilbert's story illustrates the particular cruelty of fame in the studio era, concluded the historian. His actual voice was fine. What killed his career was the voice of rumor, the voice of industry politics, and the voice of a powerful executive's vendetta. MGM could have saved him with minimal effort, but they calculated that his destruction was more profitable than his salvation. It's a calculation that Hollywood would repeat countless times with other stars who became inconvenient.
Newspaper people who go through the files so that they know their homework and know what questions to ask me so they don't start to ask, where was I?
4. Ingrid Bergman, exiled for honesty. In 1950, Ingrid Bergman wasn't just a movie star, she was an ideal. With her luminous performances in films like Casablanca, Gaslight, and Notorious, the Swedish-born actress had come to embody a particular kind of feminine perfection, intelligent yet vulnerable, beautiful yet seemingly unaware of her beauty, passionate yet restrained. In an era when the Catholic Legion of Decency wielded enormous influence over Hollywood, Bergman was that rarest of creations, a star who appealed to both sophisticated critics and moral guardians. Bergman represented something unique in post-war America, explained a film historian specializing in women's roles in classic cinema. She projected an image of European sophistication combined with wholesome values. Americans emerging from the darkness of World War II embraced her as a symbol of both grace and moral clarity, qualities they desperately wanted to believe in after years of global conflict. This carefully cultivated image made her personal decisions all the more shocking to the American public. While filming Stromboli in Italy under the direction of neo-realist filmmaker Roberto Rossellini in 1949, Bergman, then married to neurosurgeon Petter Lindstrom, with whom she had a daughter, began an affair with the Italian director. By contemporary standards, this would hardly merit more than a few days of gossip column coverage, noted a media analyst. But in 1950, for a married woman, particularly one with Bergman's wholesome image, to publicly engage in an extramarital relationship was considered not just scandalous, but almost an act of moral terrorism against American values. The situation escalated dramatically when Bergman became pregnant with Rossellini's child, while still legally married to Lindstrom. Rather than hiding the pregnancy or concocting the kind of cover story that studios typically arranged for stars in similar situations, Bergman made the unprecedented decision to acknowledge the relationship publicly. She divorced Lindstrom and married Rossellini in May 1950, less than 3 weeks after her divorce was finalized. Her refusal to lie was what truly doomed her in America, said the historian. The studios had well-established protocols for handling stars' indiscretions, private arrangements, hushed-up procedures, carefully managed publicity that would minimize damage. Bergman rejected all of that. She insisted on living her truth openly, and Hollywood never forgave her for it. The public reaction was swift and merciless. Bergman was denounced from church pulpits across America. Theater owners refused to show her films. Fan magazines that had previously celebrated her as the epitome of class and dignity now portrayed her as a fallen woman who had betrayed her fans and her own daughter. Most extraordinary was the reaction from the United States government itself. On April 14, 1950, Senator Edwin C. Johnson of Colorado took to the Senate floor to denounce Bergman in terms usually reserved for enemies of the state. He called her a powerful influence for evil, and, in a phrase that would haunt Bergman for years, a horrible example of womanhood and a powerful influence for evil. For a sitting U.S. senator to use the formal apparatus of government to attack an individual actress for her personal life was unprecedented, remarked a political historian. Johnson even went so far as to propose a bill requiring all films to be licensed based on the moral character of the performers. It's a stark reminder of how thoroughly the lines between entertainment, morality, and governance were blurred in post-war America. The professional consequences were immediate and devastating. Bergman, who had been one of Hollywood's most bankable stars, was effectively blacklisted in America. Her image was removed from advertising for her latest films. Projects that had been developed specifically for her were hastily recast. Most painfully, she was separated from her daughter, Pia, who remained in the United States with Lindstrom, while Bergman lived in Europe with Rossellini and their new child. Overnight, she went from commanding $300,000 per film, an astronomical sum in 1950, to being considered totally unemployable in American cinema, said the film historian. And unlike other actors who faced temporary scandals but eventually found routes back to at least limited careers, Bergman was completely excised from the American entertainment landscape. Her exile wasn't measured in months, but in years. What makes Bergman's case particularly striking is that no one in Hollywood's power structure came to her defense. No studio executive spoke up for her artistic contributions. No director publicly questioned whether her personal life should impact her professional opportunities. The same industry that had profited enormously from her talent simply erased her, calculating that the cost of supporting her outweighed the potential benefit. Bergman remained in Europe, making films with Rossellini that, while artistically significant, reached only a fraction of her previous audience. She maintained her dignity throughout her exile, never publicly complaining about the treatment she received. Privately, however, friends reported that she was deeply wounded by the vehemence of America's rejection. The exile lasted 7 years, an eternity in the fast-moving world of cinema. Bergman's return to American audiences came only in 1956 with Anastasia, a performance so undeniable that even her harshest critics were forced to acknowledge her extraordinary talent. She won her second Academy Award for the role, though she did not attend the ceremony, still uncertain of her reception in Hollywood. What's particularly striking about Bergman's case is that her crime was simply refusing to lie, observed the cultural analyst. Other stars engaged in far more problematic behavior, but were protected because they allowed the studios to maintain the fiction of their moral purity. Bergman's unforgivable sin was insisting on authenticity in an industry built on illusion. While Bergman eventually reclaimed her career, the 7-year exile during what should have been her prime professional years represents one of Hollywood's most shameful episodes of moral hypocrisy. A stark reminder of how quickly the industry could turn against even its most valuable talents when they failed to prioritize image over truth.
What's the matter? What's happened? Do you remember that round-robin letter we all sent each other?
Yeah.
Well, in that letter...
5. Peg Entwistle, the Hollywood sign's most tragic legend. On the morning of September 18, 1932, a hiker in the hills above Hollywood made a grim discovery beneath the famous Hollywoodland sign that overlooked the film industry's epicenter. At the bottom of the ravine lay the body of a young woman who had apparently jumped from the letter H of the iconic landmark. In her purse was a suicide note that read simply, "I am afraid, I am a coward. I am sorry for everything. If I had done this a long time ago, it would have saved a lot of pain. P.E." The woman was 24-year-old actress Peg Entwistle, and her death would become one of Hollywood's most enduring legends, a stark symbol of the industry's capacity to attract dreamers, build their hopes, and then discard them with devastating consequences. Entwistle's story represents the dark reflection of the Hollywood dream, explained a cultural historian specializing in the mythology of American cinema. For every star who found success, countless others experienced rejection, disappointment, and obscurity. Entwistle's tragedy wasn't just that she died young, but that she chose to end her life at the very symbol of the industry that had failed to embrace her talent. Born in Wales and raised in New York after her mother's death, Entwistle had established herself as a promising Broadway actress before moving to Los Angeles to pursue film opportunities. Her theatrical credentials were impressive. She had shared the stage with Humphrey Bogart and worked with the prestigious Theater Guild. But in Hollywood, where a different kind of performing skill was valued, Entwistle struggled to gain traction. The transition from stage to screen was difficult for many actors, noted the film historian. Theater required big gestures and vocal projection, while film demanded subtlety and an awareness of the camera. Some performers made this adjustment easily, others never quite mastered the different technique required. For Entwistle, who had thrived in the theatrical environment, the film world presented challenges that apparently felt insurmountable. Her Hollywood career consisted of a single significant role in the RKO film 13 Women. Even this limited opportunity ended in disappointment. Many of her scenes were cut before the film's release, reducing her part to little more than a bit role. Adding to this professional frustration was her awareness that she was running out of financial resources, just as the Great Depression was tightening its grip on the American economy. What makes Entwistle's story particularly poignant is the timing, observed the historian. She died just before 13 Women was released, never knowing that her performance, however limited by editing, would reach audiences. More tragically, according to some accounts, a letter offering her a significant stage role arrived at her home the day after her death, an opportunity that might have revived her career had she lived just slightly longer. The symbolism of her chosen method of suicide, jumping from the Hollywood sign that represented the industry's glamour and promise, created a narrative so powerful that it has overshadowed nearly every other aspect of Entwistle's life and career. She became in death a cautionary tale about the film industry's capacity for cruelty, a parable about the dangers of artistic ambition, and a ghost story that has haunted Hollywood's self-mythology for nearly a century. Entwistle's suicide had transformed her from a struggling actress into a symbol, said the cultural analyst. The industry that had largely ignored her in life posthumously incorporated her into its complex mythology. She became the quintessential Hollywood tragedy, the beautiful young woman who came seeking stardom and found only disappointment so crushing that it drove her to a spectacular public suicide from the very icon of the Dream Factory itself. What's particularly notable about Entwistle's story in the context of Abandoned Stars is that she never reached a level of success that would have created a support system within the industry. Unlike established performers who found themselves suddenly alone when scandal or failure struck, Entwistle existed on Hollywood's periphery, visible enough to feel the pain of rejection, but not successful enough to have built the connections that might have provided emotional or professional support in her darkest moment. In many ways, Entwistle represents the countless aspirants who came to Hollywood full of hope and talent, but never found the breakthrough that would have secured their place in the industry, reflected the historian. The tragedy isn't just that she died young, but but that an industry capable of recognizing and rewarding extraordinary talent somehow failed to find a place for her before despair overcame her resilience. While other stars on this list experienced dramatic falls from established heights, Entwistle's tragedy lies in never having been allowed to ascend at all. A different but equally devastating form of Hollywood abandonment that continues to claim victims, though rarely in ways as dramatically symbolic as her leap from the letter H into both physical oblivion and Hollywood immortality.
Yes, I'm giving up this racket. I'm going to Chicago to sell life insurance.
William Haynes, the man who chose dignity over stardom. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, William Billy Haynes was the definition of Hollywood success. As MGM's top male box office draw, he had pioneered a new kind of screen persona, the wisecracking, somewhat cocky young man who learns humility through love. With his handsome features, athletic physique, and impeccable comic timing, Haynes represented a modern, accessible form of masculinity that resonated strongly with audiences of the era. Haynes wasn't just popular, he was revolutionary in his own quiet way, explained a film historian specializing in early Hollywood representations of masculinity. Before Haynes, leading men were generally either swashbuckling adventurers or dignified romantic figures. Haynes created something different, a character who used humor and contemporary attitudes to connect with audiences in a more direct, relatable way. He was, in many respects, America's first modern screen comedian. This professional success had made Haynes an invaluable asset to MGM, earning him both substantial financial compensation and a level of creative input unusual for actors of the period. His films consistently delivered strong returns with minimal drama during production, making him the kind of reliable star that studios particularly valued as the industry navigated the transition from silent films to talkies. Unlike many silent stars whose careers were destroyed by the advent of sound, Haynes had successfully made the transition, with his distinctive voice and verbal delivery enhancing rather than undermining his established screen persona. By 1933, he appeared to be one of Hollywood's most securely positioned male stars, someone whose career seemed destined to continue evolving and prospering for many years to come. What studio executives, fellow performers, and close friends knew, but the public generally did not, was that Haynes was gay and had been in a committed relationship with Jimmy Shields since 1926. During the relatively permissive pre-code era, this aspect of Haynes's life had been managed through a combination of discretion, strategic publicity, and the general understanding within Hollywood that private behavior remained private as long as it didn't threaten public image or box office potential. The approach to sexuality in early Hollywood was more complex than many people realize, noted a historian of LGBTQ+ representation in cinema. There was a distinction between what the industry knew internally and what it presented to the public. As long as stars maintained appropriate public images and didn't generate scandalous publicity, there was often a surprising degree of tolerance for private lives that didn't conform to conventional morality. This delicate balance was disrupted by multiple factors in the early 1930s. The implementation of the production code in 1934 created new pressure on studios to ensure that not just their films but their performers projected moral values aligned with conservative religious principles. Simultaneously, MGM was coming under the increasingly firm control of Louis B. Mayer, whose personal conservative values and concern with wholesome public images made him particularly sensitive to potential controversies involving his contract players. These industry shifts coincided with a personal crisis for Haynes. In late 1933, he was arrested in a YMCA during what was described as a morals charge, almost certainly a euphemism for being caught in a sexual encounter with another man. While the studio had managed previous minor incidents with minimal publicity, this arrest created a more significant problem, particularly given the changing moral climate in both Hollywood and the nation at large. The arrest itself might have been manageable from a publicity standpoint, explained the historian. What transformed it into a career-ending event was Haynes's response to Louis B. Mayer's ultimatum in its aftermath. According to multiple sources, Mayer presented Haynes with a stark choice: end his relationship with Shields, agree to a lavender marriage with a woman selected by the studio, and conform to public expectations of heterosexual behavior, or lose his contract with MGM. Haynes's response to this ultimatum has become legendary in Hollywood history. Without hesitation, he reportedly told Mayer, "I'm already married. referring to his relationship with Shields. When Mayer clarified that he meant marriage to a woman, Haynes's response was equally direct. "I can act, but I won't live a lie." In that moment, with that statement, Haynes made a decision that would effectively end his film career, said the cultural analyst. He chose personal authenticity over professional success at a time when those two things were considered fundamentally incompatible for someone in his position. It was a choice that few stars before or since have been willing to make when confronted with similar ultimatums. The consequences were both immediate and absolute. MGM terminated Haynes's contract, effectively blacklisting him from major studio productions. His final film, The Marines Are Coming, for a Poverty Row studio, was released in 1934, after which his name simply disappeared from casting announcements, production reports, and fan magazine coverage. At the age of 34, in the prime of his career, and at the height of his popularity, William Haynes was simply erased from Hollywood. What makes Haynes's story unique among Hollywood downfalls is what came next. Rather than attempting to fight the blacklist or accepting eventual relegation to minor roles in B pictures, Haynes made a decisive pivot away from entertainment entirely. With Shields, he established an interior design business that would eventually become one of the most successful and influential in the country. Haynes's second act is as remarkable as his first, observed a design historian familiar with his post-Hollywood career. He essentially created the Hollywood Regency style that would define luxury interiors for decades. His client list included Joan Crawford, Gloria Swanson, Carole Lombard, and numerous other stars who defied the industry blacklist to support their former colleague. By the 1940s, a Billy Haynes interior was a status symbol that even those who had participated in his professional exile coveted for their own homes. This extraordinary professional reinvention was matched by personal stability that was rare in Hollywood circles. Haynes and Shields remained together until Haynes's death in 1973, a 47-year relationship that outlasted virtually all of the studio-arranged marriages of his former peers. Their home became an informal salon for the Hollywood community, with former colleagues often commenting on the apparent happiness and contentment that Haynes had found away from the constraints of studio control. What's particularly poignant about Haynes's story is that he never expressed regret for the choice that ended his film career, said the LGBTQ+ historian. When friends would mention what he had given up or the fame he had lost, he would reportedly gesture around at his beautiful home, his successful business, and most importantly, at Shields, and say, "I've got all this instead. I haven't lost anything important." The industry that had exiled him eventually came to recognize the injustice of his treatment, though this recognition came too late for Haynes himself to witness it. In retrospect, film historians have identified him as one of the first major victims of Hollywood's formalized homophobia, a cautionary example that would influence generations of LGBTQ+ performers to hide their authentic selves to preserve their careers. Haynes's story reveals both the cruelty of the studio system and the possibility of dignity beyond it, concluded the cultural analyst. While MGM and Hollywood as a whole abandoned him completely for the crime of refusing to deny his authentic self, he constructed a life of meaning, creativity, and love that ultimately proved more enduring than the film career he sacrificed. It's a rare example of a star who was truly saved, not by the industry that discarded him, but by his own courage, talent, and refusal to betray his most essential truth.
Then the whole town will posse up, and no matter which way you turn, they'll be pouring lead at you until they get that reward.
7. Barbara Payton, from glamour to gutter. In 1950, Barbara Payton appeared to be Hollywood's next great sex symbol. With her platinum blonde hair, curvaceous figure, and smoldering screen presence, the 22-year-old Wisconsin native had rapidly ascended from bit parts to starring roles opposite legends like James Cagney in Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye. Studio executives spoke of her as a potential successor to Lana Turner, a glamorous blonde with enough acting ability to elevate her beyond mere decoration. Payton had that indefinable quality that separates stars from simply attractive performers, explained a film historian specializing in post-war Hollywood. The camera loved her, but more importantly, she projected a combination of sensuality and vulnerability that resonated with audiences. There was a rawness to her screen presence that felt authentic in an era when many actresses seemed overly polished and manufactured. This promising career trajectory began to derail almost immediately, not because of any failure of talent, but because of what the industry perceived as personal conduct unsuitable for a rising star. Peyton's romantic life became fodder for gossip columnists when she became involved in a very public love triangle with actors Franchot Tone and Tom Neal, a situation that escalated into physical violence when Neal brutally beat Tone, leaving him hospitalized with severe injuries including a broken nose, concussion, and numerous facial fractures. The Tone-Neal-Peyton triangle created exactly the kind of publicity that studios dreaded, noted the historian. While audiences might enjoy reading about such scandals, the studios were hypersensitive to anything that contradicted the carefully constructed moral images they were trying to project, particularly after the implementation of the production code. The fact that Peyton was positioned as the cause of violence between two men made her particularly vulnerable to industry punishment. This punishment came swiftly as casting directors began to exclude Peyton from consideration for significant roles. Her contract with Warner Brothers was not renewed, and other major studios proved reluctant to sign an actress whose personal life had generated such negative publicity. By 1955, just 5 years after her breakthrough performance, Peyton had been relegated to low-budget exploitation films, a precipitous fall for an actress who had so recently shared the screen with Hollywood royalty. What makes Peyton's case particularly striking is the speed of her professional abandonment, observed the cultural analyst. There was no gradual decline, no series of diminishing opportunities, just a near-complete industry rejection once she had been labeled problematic. The same studios that had been grooming her for major stardom suddenly couldn't distance themselves quickly enough. This professional rejection coincided with escalating personal problems for Peyton. Her marriage to Tone lasted less than 2 months, and subsequent relationships proved equally volatile and short-lived. Financial difficulties mounted as quality acting jobs disappeared entirely, leading to increasingly desperate measures to maintain the lifestyle to which she had briefly become accustomed. By the late 1950s, Peyton's situation had become truly dire, said the historian. With no film offers forthcoming and her savings depleted, she began the tragic descent that would define the latter portion of her life. She turned to alcohol for solace, which further diminished her employability, creating a downward spiral that eventually led to prostitution, a fall from grace so complete that it's almost unparalleled in Hollywood history. The final decade of Peyton's life represents one of the most devastating examples of Hollywood abandonment in the industry's history. By the early 1960s, the woman who had once been featured on magazine covers and touted as the next great star was working as a streetwalker on Sunset Boulevard, sometimes just blocks from the theaters where her films had once played. Former colleagues and industry figures who encountered her during this period reportedly crossed the street to avoid the uncomfortable reminder of how completely the system had failed one of its own. What's particularly chilling about Peyton's story is how thoroughly the industry erased her, noted the cultural analyst. It wasn't just that she couldn't get work, it's that the entire apparatus of Hollywood pretended she had never existed at all. Former co-stars declined to acknowledge their previous work with her. Studios buried the films she had appeared in. It was a comprehensive exclusion designed to prevent her cautionary tale from tarnishing the industry's carefully maintained illusions. Peyton died in 1967 at the age of 39, her body ravaged by the effects of alcoholism and the harsh realities of life on the streets. Her obituaries, when they appeared at all, were brief and often focused more on her scandals than her talents. The industry that had once celebrated her beauty and potential offered no tributes, no retrospectives, no acknowledgement of its role in her tragic decline. Barbara Peyton's story represents the ultimate cautionary tale about the disposability of talent in Hollywood, concluded the historian. She went from studio grooming to street prostitution in less than a decade, not because she couldn't act, not because audiences rejected her, but because an industry built on the illusion of moral perfection couldn't accommodate a young woman whose messy personal life contradicted the fantasies it was selling. When she needed help, not a single hand was extended, a stark reminder of how conditional Hollywood's embrace has always been.
Telling you, I don't think I have tears for the rest of my life.
8. Lupe Velez, the Mexican Spitfire's final flame. In the 1930s and early 1940s, Lupe Velez brought a whirlwind of energy to Hollywood that was unlike anything audiences had seen before. Nicknamed the Mexican Spitfire, after her popular film series, Velez embodied a vibrant, uninhibited approach to both her career and her personal life that challenged the buttoned-up conventions of Depression-era America. Velez was revolutionary in many ways, explained a film historian specializing in Latin American contributions to early Hollywood. She refused to play stereotypical ethnic roles, insisting on being cast as a leading lady rather than a maid or exotic temptress. Her Mexican Spitfire character was fiery and impulsive, yes, but also smart, funny, and always the center of the story. In an era when Hispanic actors were largely relegated to background roles, Velez demanded and received top billing.
I've never seen you so beautiful.
Nine. Gene Tierney, beauty broken by tragedy. In the early 1940s, Gene Tierney represented the pinnacle of Hollywood elegance. With her perfect bone structure, distinctive overbite, and mesmerizing green eyes, she embodied a sophisticated beauty that set her apart from other actresses of the era. But it was her performances in films like Laura, Leave Her to Heaven, and The Ghost and Mrs. Muir that established her as far more than just another pretty face. She was a genuinely gifted actress, capable of extraordinary emotional range. Tierney possessed a unique quality on screen, explained a film historian specializing in film noir. She could project both vulnerability and danger simultaneously. There was something mysterious behind her eyes, a suggestion of hidden depths that made her particularly effective in complex roles that required psychological nuance. What audiences couldn't see beneath this captivating screen presence was a woman battling increasingly devastating personal tragedies and the mental health crisis they would eventually trigger. The first and perhaps most profound of these tragedies involved her daughter Daria, born in 1943. During Tierney's pregnancy, she had contracted rubella from a fan who, despite being under quarantine for the disease, had broken it to get an autograph from the star at a tennis match. The rubella infection had catastrophic consequences for Tierney's unborn child, said a medical historian familiar with the case. Daria was born severely disabled, deaf, partially blind, and with significant cognitive impairments. In an era before widespread understanding of congenital rubella syndrome, this outcome was particularly shocking and unexplained to the young mother. The impact of this tragedy on Tierney's emotional well-being was profound and long-lasting. Adding to this burden was her discovery, years later at a Hollywood party, that she had actually met the fan who had infected her. The woman approached Tierney and cheerfully recounted breaking quarantine to meet her, completely unaware of the devastating consequences her actions had caused. Learning the specific cause of her daughter's disabilities, and that it could have been prevented if not for a fan's thoughtless action, created a trauma from which Tierney never fully recovered, noted the cultural analyst. It was the beginning of a psychological unraveling that would eventually destroy her career and nearly claim her life. By the late 1940s, despite continued professional success, Tierney was experiencing increasingly severe symptoms of depression. Following a painful divorce from designer Oleg Cassini and ongoing stress related to her daughter's care, she began to withdraw from colleagues and exhibit behavior that concerned those close to her. Studio executives, more focused on her commercial value than her well-being, continued to push her into demanding roles despite clear signs of her deteriorating mental health. What's particularly disturbing about Tierney's case is how long the studios extracted work from her while ignoring the obvious signs of serious psychiatric illness, observed the historian. There were incidents on set where she would become disoriented, forget lines, or exhibit clearly dissociative behavior. Rather than ensuring she received proper medical care, production teams would simply work around these episodes, often using doubles for scenes she couldn't complete. The breaking point came in 1953 when Tierney, now suffering from what would later be diagnosed as bipolar disorder with psychotic features, attempted suicide by trying to jump from a ledge of her mother's apartment building. This incident could no longer be hidden from the public or managed within the production environment. She was hospitalized against her will, the beginning of a series of institutional commitments that would include devastating treatments like insulin shock therapy and electroconvulsive therapy. Once Tierney's mental illness became public knowledge, the industry's abandonment was swift and complete, said the cultural analyst. The same studios that had profited from her talents while ignoring her deteriorating condition now viewed her as damaged goods, an investment too risky to maintain. Roles that would have naturally gone to her were quickly reassigned to other actresses. Her name was removed from projects in development. It was as if Hollywood had collectively decided that she had ceased to exist. During Tierney's hospitalizations, which stretched over several years, she received almost no support from the industry that had once celebrated her as one of its most valuable assets. Former co-stars, directors, and executives who had worked closely with her made no public statements of support. The studio publicity machine, which had once touted her as the epitome of glamour and sophistication, now maintained complete silence about her condition and whereabouts. The contrast between the industry's treatment of Tierney's physical versus mental health issues is telling, noted the medical historian. Had she been hospitalized for cancer or another physical illness, there likely would have been public expressions of support, perhaps even benefit events or other demonstrations of Hollywood solidarity. But mental illness carried such stigma that the response was essentially to pretend she had never existed at all. Though Tierney eventually recovered enough to attempt a return to acting in the late 1950s, the damage to her career was irreparable. Studios remained reluctant to cast an actress with a known history of mental illness in significant roles, fearing both potential production complications and audience reaction. The few parts she did secure were pale shadows of the complex, demanding roles that had once showcased her considerable talents. In Hollywood's brutal calculation, Tierney had transformed from asset to liability, explained the film historian. The industry that had built her up and profited from her gifts abandoned her precisely when she most needed support. When she was healthy enough to work again, that same industry refused to reinvest in her rehabilitation, a stark reminder that in the studio system, human beings were ultimately viewed as disposable commodities rather than artists deserving of care and second chances. Tierney eventually found a measure of personal happiness, remarrying and largely withdrawing from public life. But her career, once among the most promising in Hollywood, never recovered from the industry's abandonment during her illness. Her story stands as one of the most disturbing examples of Hollywood's callous treatment of stars facing mental health challenges, a pattern that would tragically repeat itself with many other performers in subsequent decades.
Yeah. Who? Oh, Gary, I'm sorry I got tied up and I couldn't meet you, but... What?
10. George Reeves, typecast to death. In the early 1950s, George Reeves became a cultural icon through his portrayal of Superman in the groundbreaking television series Adventures of Superman. For millions of American children gathered around newly purchased TV sets, Reeves wasn't just playing a superhero, he was Superman, a living embodiment of truth, justice, and the American way. The identification between Reeves and Superman was complete in a way that's difficult to imagine in our more media-savvy era, explained a television historian specializing in early broadcast culture. Children would literally bring injured birds to personal appearances, believing Reeves could save them with his superpowers. The line between actor and character was non-existent for much of his audience. This powerful identification created both opportunities and constraints for Reeves. While the role brought him greater fame than he had achieved in his earlier film career, which included a small but memorable part in Gone with the Wind, it also created significant typecasting issues. Studios hesitated to cast the man viewed by the public as the virtuous Superman in roles that might contradict this wholesome image. Reeves found himself in a peculiar prison of fame, noted a cultural historian who has studied the Superman phenomenon. He was recognized everywhere he went, adored by children nationwide, and yet increasingly unable to find work beyond the character that had made him famous. It was a particular kind of career trap that television was only beginning to create. The actor so thoroughly identified with a single role that no other opportunities remained available. By 1959, Reeves had completed filming on the 7th season of Adventures of Superman and was contemplating his future. Though he had occasionally expressed frustration with the limitations of the role, he had recently become engaged to socialite Leonore Lemon and was making plans for their life together. He had also been discussing directing opportunities and had scheduled meetings about potential new projects. On the evening of June 16, 1959, Reeves was at his Benedict Canyon home with Lemon and several friends. The group had been drinking, and witnesses later reported that Reeves's mood seemed alternately irritable and withdrawn. Around midnight, after a brief argument with Lemon, Reeves went upstairs to his bedroom. Minutes later, a single gunshot rang out. Reeves was found lying across his bed with a gunshot wound to his head and a Luger pistol between his feet. He was 45 years old. What happened in that bedroom instantly transformed Reeves from cultural icon to tragic headline, said the historian. Overnight, Superman, the invulnerable hero who could not be harmed by bullets, was dead by a gunshot. His mortality starkly contrasted with the immortality of his character. The official ruling was suicide, but from the beginning, Circumstances surrounding Reeves's death raised troubling questions. No fingerprints were found on the gun. Reeves had unusual bruises on his body that were never fully explained. Most significantly, multiple witnesses reported hearing the gunshot after Reeves had gone upstairs, followed by the sound of his bedroom door opening and closing, and then a second pause before someone called out that there was a shooting. These inconsistencies fed speculation that has never fully subsided, noted a crime historian who has studied the case. Was it actually murder disguised as suicide? Was it an accident during a drunken game gone wrong? Or was it, as officially ruled, a deliberate act by a man increasingly trapped by a role he couldn't escape? Adding further complexity to the case were Reeves's connections to Eddie Mannix, a powerful MGM executive known for his mob ties and reputation as a fixer for studio problems. Reeves had been involved in a long-term relationship with Mannix's wife, Toni, who had bought Reeves the very house in which he died and who was reportedly devastated by his engagement to Lemon. The Mannix connection introduced a layer of Hollywood power politics that has fueled conspiracy theories for decades, explained the television historian. Eddie Mannix had both the connections and the motivation to arrange a murder disguised as suicide, though no concrete evidence has ever emerged to support this theory. What's undeniable is that the mysterious circumstances created a cloud over Reeves's death that permanently altered how the public viewed both the actor and his iconic character. Whatever the truth behind Reeves's death, its impact on his legacy was immediate and devastating. Parents across America found themselves struggling to explain to heartbroken children why Superman had killed himself. Television stations temporarily pulled Adventures of Superman from their schedules, concerned about the psychological impact on young viewers. When the series eventually returned to syndication, it carried an almost palpable shadow, the knowledge that the hero on screen had met a tragic and potentially sordid end. Reeves's death fundamentally changed the Superman brand in ways that resonated for decades, observed the cultural analyst. The character had embodied an uncomplicated heroism and invulnerability. Suddenly, that narrative was complicated by very adult themes of mortality, potential scandal, and the gap between public image and private reality. It was a loss of innocence not just for the character, but for an entire generation of viewers. What makes Reeves's case particularly notable in the context of abandoned stars is how thoroughly his identity had been subsumed by a single role, and how little support existed for him as he attempted to navigate the complex transition beyond it. Unlike stars who face scandals after establishing diverse careers, Reeves had become so completely identified with Superman that the industry seemed to have difficulty conceptualizing him as a performer with broader capabilities. In many ways, Reeves was abandoned before his death, concluded the historian. Typecast to the point of professional paralysis, caught in a role that simultaneously made him nationally famous and increasingly unemployable in other contexts, he represented a new kind of Hollywood casualty, the television star so thoroughly defined by a character that his own identity became secondary. Whether his death was suicide or something more sinister, it highlighted the particular vulnerability of performers whose public image became a prison from which they could find no escape.
Look, it's not my fault. Besides, one day more is not going to make any difference.
11. Montgomery Clift, the beautiful face shattered. In the early 1950s, Montgomery Clift represented a new kind of male star in Hollywood, sensitive, introspective, and bringing an emotional vulnerability to his performances that contrasted sharply with the stoic masculinity that had dominated cinema in previous decades. Along with Marlon Brando and James Dean, Clift embodied a more complex vision of American manhood, one that allowed for inner conflict and psychological depth. Clift was revolutionary, explained a film historian specializing in changing presentations of masculinity in cinema. Before Clift, leading men generally projected a kind of untroubled confidence and conventional attractiveness. Clift brought something different, a palpable inner life, a sense that beneath his extraordinary physical beauty lay genuine complexity and even torment. Audiences, particularly women, found this combination irresistible. This magnetic screen presence had made Clift one of Hollywood's most respected actors by 1956. With acclaimed performances in films like The Heiress, A Place in the Sun, and From Here to Eternity, he had established himself as not just a beautiful face, but a serious artist, someone who approached each role with extraordinary intellectual rigor and emotional commitment. On the evening of May 12, 1956, Clift attended a dinner party at the Benedict Canyon home of his close friend and A Place in the Sun co-star Elizabeth Taylor and her then-husband Michael Wilding. Guests at the gathering later reported that Clift seemed unusually tense and consumed several drinks throughout the evening. Around midnight, despite concerns about his state, Clift insisted on driving himself home. What happened next transformed Clift's life and career in ways that no one could have imagined, said the historian. The winding roads of Benedict Canyon have claimed many victims over the years, but few accidents have had such profound consequences for Hollywood history as Clift's collision with a telephone pole that night. Driving his Chevrolet down the dark canyon road, Clift lost control of his vehicle and crashed violently into a telephone pole. The impact was devastating, leaving him with a broken nose, a broken jaw, a fractured sinus, and severe facial lacerations that would require extensive reconstructive surgery. Had it not been for the quick thinking of Elizabeth Taylor, who rushed to the scene after hearing the crash and reportedly pulled broken teeth from Clift's throat to prevent him from choking, he might not have survived at all. The physical trauma was only the beginning, noted a medical historian who has studied famous Hollywood injuries. Clift underwent multiple surgeries in the aftermath of the accident, including extensive work to reconstruct his shattered face. But the Montgomery Clift who eventually emerged from this medical ordeal was visibly, unmistakably different from the man who had been considered one of Hollywood's most beautiful actors. The changes to Clift's appearance were profound. His face, once perfectly symmetrical, now showed noticeable distortion. His famously expressive features seemed partially frozen, limiting the emotional range that had been central to his acting technique. Perhaps most significantly, his eyes now conveyed a permanent pain that no acting could conceal, the look of someone who had experienced profound trauma and was never quite able to move beyond it. The accident didn't just alter Clift's appearance, it fundamentally changed his relationship with the camera, explained the film historian. Before the crash, the camera loved Clift unconditionally, capturing his beauty from any angle. After the crash, filming him became a technical challenge, requiring specific lighting, careful camera placement, and post-production techniques to minimize the visible damage. What had once been effortless now required extraordinary accommodation. These technical challenges translated directly into diminished career opportunities. Directors who might have cast the pre-accident Clift hesitated to work with an actor who now required such specialized handling. Studios that had previously competed for his services began to view him as a potential liability rather than an asset. Most painfully for Clift himself, roles that called for romantic leads or conventional attractiveness, once his stock in trade, largely disappeared from his options. The industry's reaction was swift and merciless, said the cultural analyst. While publicly expressing sympathy for Clift's situation, Hollywood quietly began to reduce his opportunities and adjust expectations for his career. What makes this particularly cruel is that Clift's talent hadn't diminished at all, only his marketability as a conventional leading man. But in an industry built on image, that distinction made little practical difference. The psychological impact of this professional relegation was devastating for Clift. Already struggling with internal conflicts about his sexuality and his place in Hollywood's star system, he now faced a stark daily reminder of how precarious fame could be, how quickly adoration could turn to pity, or worse, indifference. His response to this trauma increasingly took the form of self-medication with alcohol and prescription drugs, creating a downward spiral that further limited his professional options. What's particularly poignant about Clift's situation is that he continued to deliver extraordinary performances after the accident, observed the film historian. His work in The Young Lions, Judgment at Nuremberg, and particularly The Misfits, showcases an actor of remarkable depth and sensitivity. But these performances came at an increasingly heavy personal cost, requiring more and more artificial support just to function on set. By the early 1960s, Clift's physical and psychological deterioration had become impossible to ignore. Directors reported that he sometimes could not remember his lines or required dozens of takes for simple scenes. His physical appearance continued to decline, with the combined effects of the accident and his increasing substance use creating a visage that bore little resemblance to the beautiful young man who had once seemed destined for permanent stardom. On July 23, 1966, Clift was found dead in his New York townhouse at the age of 45. The official cause was listed as a heart attack, but those close to him recognized that his death was the final result of the long decline that had begun on that canyon road 10 years earlier. In a cruel irony, his final film, The Defector, released after his death, found limited distribution and has been largely forgotten, an unworthy conclusion to one of the most significant acting careers of the mid-20th century. In a single night, through a single turn of a steering wheel, Montgomery Clift's career trajectory changed forever, concluded the historian. What makes his story particularly tragic is that, unlike some stars whose talents were perhaps limited from the start, Clift was genuinely extraordinary. An actor of rare gifts whose career destruction came not through any professional failing, but through a random accident that forever altered how the world saw him. It's a stark reminder of the physical fragility that underlies even the most seemingly perfect Hollywood image.
I simply must tell you what a divine experience I had yesterday. We were all rehearsing, you see, and so we stopped for dinner.
12. Tallulah Bankhead, too wild for the system. Tallulah Bankhead defied categorization. With her deep, husky voice, razor-sharp wit, and utterly uninhibited approach to both her career and personal life, the Alabama-born performer carved out a unique position in American entertainment that straddled theater, film, radio, and eventually television. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Bankhead established herself as one of the stage's most magnetic presences, with performances that combined technical brilliance with a raw emotional intensity that audiences found mesmerizing. Bankhead wasn't just talented, she was revolutionary, explained a theater historian specializing in early 20th century American stage. At a time when most actresses were still trapped in very narrow conceptions of femininity, Bankhead created performances of extraordinary range and daring. She could be vulnerable and fierce, comic and tragic, sometimes within the same scene. There was nothing artificial about her work. It was always deeply, sometimes uncomfortably, authentic. This same authenticity extended to Bankhead's personal life, where she refused to conform to the expectations placed on women in general and actresses in particular. She was openly bisexual in an era when such acknowledgement could destroy careers. She drank heavily, used drugs recreationally, and spoke about sex with a frankness that shocked even her cosmopolitan contemporaries. Perhaps most threatening to the power structure of her time, she refused to apologize for any of it. What made Bankhead particularly problematic for the entertainment industry wasn't just her behavior, but her attitude toward it, noted the cultural analyst. Many stars engaged in behavior that contradicted public morality, but most maintained at least the pretense of conventional respectability. Bankhead rejected the very concept of pretense. Her famous line, "I'm as pure as the driven slush," perfectly captured her insistence on being accepted on her own uncompromising terms. This refusal to maintain a respectable facade created significant obstacles to Bankhead's film career, particularly as Hollywood implemented the production code in the early 1930s and began enforcing increasingly strict standards for both on-screen content and off-screen behavior. Studio executives, concerned about potential controversy, hesitated to cast an actress whose personal reputation might overshadow her performances or attract negative attention from moral watchdog groups. Bankhead should have been one of the greatest film stars of her generation, said the film historian. She had the talent, the presence, the distinctive voice and style that separates genuine stars from merely competent performers. What she didn't have, and refused to acquire, was the willingness to subordinate her authentic self to the manufactured image that the studio system demanded from its female stars. While Bankhead did appear in several notable films, including Alfred Hitchcock's Lifeboat, 1944, for which she received critical acclaim, her film career never approached the prominence or consistency of her stage work. As her reputation for unpredictable behavior and uninhibited sexuality grew, film opportunities diminished, a clear message from the industry that her talents, however exceptional, could not compensate for what executives perceived as her liability as a public figure. The industry's abandonment of Bankhead was gradual rather than sudden, observed the historian. It took the form not of an explicit blacklist, but of a quiet drift away, fewer offers, smaller roles, less prestigious projects. By the 1950s, she had essentially been marginalized in film, despite being widely acknowledged as one of the most gifted actresses of her generation. This professional marginalization coincided with personal challenges that further limited Bankhead's opportunities. Years of heavy drinking and drug use had taken a toll on both her health and her reliability. Her famously husky voice, once one of her most distinctive assets, became increasingly raspy and sometimes difficult to understand. Productions that might have been willing to overlook her controversial reputation became reluctant to risk the practical challenges that her physical condition sometimes created. What's particularly tragic about Bankhead's later career is that her talent remained largely intact even as her body began to betray her, noted the theater historian. When she could summon the physical resources to support her artistic instincts, she was still capable of extraordinary work. But those moments became increasingly rare and unpredictable, making her a risky investment for producers who prioritized reliability over the possibility of brilliance. By the 1960s, Bankhead had been effectively relegated to self-parody, appearing as an exaggerated version of herself on television talk shows and in campy films that capitalized on her outrageous persona while providing little opportunity for the genuine acting ability that had once defined her career. The industry that had never fully embraced her now invited her to participate only as a caricature, the outrageous, hard-living legend whose antics could provide reliable shock value for audiences. In her final years, Bankhead became trapped in a cruel paradox, explained the cultural analyst. The very qualities that had made her too unconventional for Hollywood's conventional star system, her outrageousness, her refusal to conform, her insistence on living and speaking her truth, now became the only aspects of her identity that the industry was interested in marketing. The brilliant actress was subsumed by the scandalous personality, reducing a multidimensional artist to a one-dimensional character. When Bankhead died in 1968 at the age of 66, her obituaries focused more on her outrageous quotes and notorious behavior than on her considerable artistic achievements. The entertainment industry that had never fully accepted her in life now embraced her posthumously as a colorful character, a convenient simplification that obscured both the complexity of her talent and the systemic barriers that had prevented that talent from reaching its full potential in film. Bankhead's story represents a particular kind of Hollywood abandonment, concluded the historian. She wasn't destroyed by a single scandal or mistake, but by a systematic unwillingness to accommodate a woman who refused to pretend to be something she wasn't. In an industry built on manufactured images and carefully controlled narratives, her insistence on authentic self-expression represented a threat that could never be fully incorporated or accepted. The result was a career that, for all its notable achievements, remains a fraction of what it might have been had the system been capable of embracing rather than marginalizing her extraordinary talents and equally extraordinary personality.
The enormous number of people they had, but I really don't think it helped me much.
Yes. Now,
13. Frances Farmer, institutionalized and erased. Few Hollywood stories are as disturbing as that of Frances Farmer, a strikingly beautiful and fiercely intelligent actress who first gained attention with her performance in Come and Get It, 1936. Farmer represented something new and challenging in Hollywood, an actress who approached her craft with serious intellectual commitment rather than merely as a vehicle for glamour or conventional emotion. Farmer wasn't just talented, she was dangerous, explained a film historian specializing in women's roles in classic cinema. She refused to view acting as simply a matter of looking pretty and reciting lines. She studied with the group theater, embraced Stanislavski's method approach to performance, and insisted on bringing psychological depth to roles that studios often preferred to keep superficial. This combination of beauty and intellectual seriousness made her a potential revolutionary force in an industry that preferred its actresses compliant and uncomplicated. This professional independence was matched by a personal independence equally unusual for actresses of her era. Farmer was outspoken about political and social issues, maintained friendships with known leftists during a period of growing anti-communist sentiment, and showed little interest in the publicity rituals that studios typically demanded of their contract players. She treated acting as a serious profession rather than a component of celebrity, an attitude that industry executives found both confusing and threatening. What made Farmer particularly problematic for the studio system wasn't just her artistic seriousness, but her refusal to participate in the machinery of stardom, noted the cultural analyst. She wouldn't pose for cheesecake photos, resisted manufactured romances created for publicity purposes, and spoke to the press with an honesty that publicity departments found terrifying. In an era when studios expected complete control over their female stars' images, Farmer's insistence on authentic self-presentation was viewed almost as a form of rebellion. This professional tension coincided with personal challenges that would eventually provide the mechanism for Farmer's complete destruction. By the early 1940s, she was experiencing increasing conflicts with directors, producers, and studio executives who found her unwillingness to compromise artistically or personally frustrating. These professional conflicts, combined with the collapse of her marriage and financial pressures, contributed to a period of significant emotional stress that occasionally manifested in erratic behavior. The breaking point came in 1942 when Farmer was arrested twice within a matter of weeks, said the historian. The first incident involved a traffic violation. The second, more serious charge stemmed from an altercation during which she allegedly struck a makeup artist on a studio lot. While these incidents might have been managed with minimal publicity for a more compliant star, the studio machine that had found Farmer difficult now appeared to use these events as an opportunity to discipline her more dramatically. What followed was one of Hollywood's most disturbing examples of systemic abuse of power. Rather than providing support for an obviously struggling young woman, the industry apparatus, in cooperation with Farmer's mother and the legal system, initiated a process that would result in Farmer being declared mentally incompetent and involuntarily committed to a series of increasingly brutal psychiatric institutions. The legal mechanisms used against Farmer were disturbingly thin, noted a legal historian who has studied the case. Based primarily on her mother's petition and highly subjective assessments of her uncooperative behavior, a charge often leveled against women who challenged authority, Farmer was essentially deprived of her liberty and subjected to treatments that would now be considered forms of torture. The evidence suggests this was less about genuine psychiatric concern than about controlling and punishing a woman who had refused to conform to industry expectations. Once institutionalized, Farmer encountered the most brutal aspects of mid-century psychiatric practice. According to her later accounts and those of witnesses, she was subjected to insulin shock therapy, electroconvulsive therapy without anesthesia, ice baths, and physical restraints. Most disturbing were allegations that she may have been one of many female patients who underwent a transorbital lobotomy, a procedure that involved inserting an ice pick-like instrument through the eye socket to sever connections in the brain's frontal lobe. While the lobotomy claim remains controversial, what's undeniable throughout this ordeal, the entertainment industry that had once promoted Farmer as a rising star maintained complete silence about her circumstances. No colleagues publicly advocated for her release or improved treatment. No studio executives questioned the extreme measures being taken against a young woman whose primary offenses had been assertiveness and occasional difficult behavior. The machinery of fame that had built her up now participated, through silent complicity, in her complete destruction. What's particularly chilling about Farmer's case is the totality of her abandonment, observed the cultural analyst. Once she was labeled mentally ill, a designation that the evidence suggests was applied more for behavioral non-compliance than for genuine psychiatric disorder, she essentially ceased to exist for the industry that had previously benefited from her talents. There were no benefit performances, no campaigns for her release, not even basic human concern for her welfare. It was as if Hollywood had collectively decided that she had never existed at all. When Farmer was finally released after years of institutionalization, she found that not only had her career been destroyed, but even the memory of her contributions had been largely erased from public consciousness. The promising young actress who had once been mentioned alongside Katharine Hepburn and Bette Davis as representing the future of serious female performance in Hollywood had been reduced to a cautionary tale, a whispered warning about the consequences of challenging the system's control. Farmer's fate represents perhaps the most extreme example of what could happen to stars who refuse to comply with industry demands, concluded the historian. She wasn't just professionally destroyed, she was physically and psychologically dismantled through institutional mechanisms that operated with the tacit approval of the entertainment industry. Her story isn't just about career abandonment, but about a system willing to participate in the actual destruction of a human being who had dared to assert independence within its carefully controlled boundaries.
This forest is wide. It can shelter and clothe and feed a band of good determined men, good swordsmen, good archers, good fighters.
14. Errol Flynn, the swashbuckler who crashed. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, no male star embodied adventure and romance more completely than Errol Flynn. With his athletic physique, roguish smile, and unmatched skill at staged swordplay, the Tasmanian-born actor defined the swashbuckling hero in films like Captain Blood, The Adventures of Robin Hood, and The Seahawk. For millions of moviegoers, Flynn represented a particular kind of masculine ideal, daring, charming, and irresistible to women both on-screen and off. Flynn wasn't just popular, he was the physical embodiment of fantasy, explained a film historian specializing in action cinema. At a time when America was emerging from the Depression and heading toward war, Flynn provided a vision of heroic masculinity that combined physical courage with wit and style. His performances weren't just entertaining, they were aspirational for men and objects of desire for women. Few stars have ever aligned so perfectly with the cultural moment and the requirements of their genre. This carefully constructed image of dashing heroism was complicated by Flynn's off-screen behavior, which increasingly diverged from his on-screen persona in problematic ways. While audiences embraced the slightly dangerous quality he brought to his characters, the real Flynn was moving into territory that even Hollywood's powerful publicity machine struggled to manage or conceal. Flynn's private life had always involved a certain amount of carousing, noted the cultural analyst. Early in his career, this was relatively easily managed and even incorporated into his raffish public image. In like Flynn became a popular expression for seduction, acknowledging and essentially celebrating his reputation as a womanizer. But as the 1940s progressed, his behavior became increasingly difficult to frame as charming roguishness rather than genuinely concerning conduct. The most serious challenge to Flynn's career came in 1942 when he was charged with the statutory assault of two teenage girls, 17-year-old Betty Hansen and 16-year-old Peggy Satterlee. The subsequent trials became a media sensation, with Flynn's attorneys aggressively attacking the credibility and character of the young accusers, while portraying the actor as the victim of opportunistic charges motivated by his wealth and fame. The trial strategy was brutally effective but ethically disturbing, said a legal historian who has studied famous Hollywood cases. Flynn's defense team, led by the formidable Jerry Giesler, essentially put the teenage accusers on trial, implying they were sexually experienced young women who had pursued the actor rather than victims of predatory behavior. This approach, combined with Flynn's still considerable public goodwill, resulted in his acquittal on all charges. While Flynn legally survived the statutory charges, the trial marked the beginning of his professional decline. Despite the acquittal, the detailed testimony about his behavior, including his clear preference for very young women, created a shadow over his heroic screen image that never fully dissipated. Studios continued to cast him in swashbuckling roles, but audience enthusiasm began to wane as the gap between the noble characters he portrayed and his increasingly troubled public image became harder to ignore. The studio initially stood by Flynn during the trial because he represented a significant financial investment, explained the film historian, but their support was purely pragmatic rather than personal. As his box office appeal diminished and his personal problems escalated, that support evaporated with remarkable speed. By the late 1940s, the same publicity machine that had once worked tirelessly to protect him was essentially allowing his public destruction to unfold without intervention. This professional abandonment coincided with Flynn's accelerating personal decline. Years of extraordinary alcohol consumption had begun to take a visible toll on his once perfect physique. He developed chronic health problems, including recurrent malaria and tuberculosis. His legendary good looks faded prematurely, making him increasingly difficult to cast in the action hero roles that had defined his career. By his early 40s, he often appeared a decade older, a devastating transformation for an actor whose appeal had rested significantly on his physical presence. What's particularly poignant about Flynn's decline is that beneath the carousing and increasingly difficult behavior was a genuine actor who felt trapped by his own image, observed the cultural analyst. In his later years, he repeatedly expressed frustration at being permitted to play only variations of the same swashbuckling character, even as he became physically less capable of fulfilling the demands of those roles. The industry that had created and profited from Errol Flynn the action hero had little interest in developing Errol Flynn the serious actor, who might have extended his career in more sustainable directions. By the mid-1950s, Flynn's career in major Hollywood productions had essentially ended. His final significant roles came in low-budget, often foreign-produced films that traded on his fading name recognition while providing little opportunity for the genuine talent that occasionally emerged even in his most troubled periods. His physical decline accelerated, with his once athletic frame becoming bloated from alcohol and his health continuing to deteriorate. The industry's abandonment of Flynn was particularly cruel because it coincided with his development as a more thoughtful performer, noted the historian. His performance in The Sun Also Rises, 1957, suggested depths that his earlier swashbucklers had rarely allowed him to explore, but by then, the machinery that had built him up had moved on to younger, healthier action stars, leaving Flynn to navigate his final professional years without the support system that might have facilitated a meaningful late-career reinvention. When Flynn died in 1959 at the age of 50, his obituaries focused more on his scandals and decline than on his considerable contributions to film history. The industry that had once celebrated him as the definition of heroic masculinity now portrayed him primarily as a cautionary tale, a star who had destroyed himself through excess and poor choices. This simplistic narrative conveniently obscured the role that the studio system itself had played in both creating the conditions for his problems and abandoning him when those problems became inconvenient. Flynn's story reveals the particular cruelty of fame for stars whose appeal rests significantly on physical attributes, concluded the cultural analyst. The same industry that had marketed him almost exclusively as a physical specimen, the perfect embodiment of active, virile masculinity, discarded him when his body could no longer sustain that image. What makes this especially tragic is that Flynn, for all his flaws and self-destructive behaviors, possessed genuine acting talent that was largely squandered because it didn't fit the narrow parameters of the persona that had been created for him and that ultimately imprisoned him both professionally and personally.
Why am I like this? I hate to get angry, but I just can't help it.
15. Clara Bow, the it girl who lost everything. In the late 1920s, Clara Bow wasn't just a movie star. She was a cultural phenomenon. Dubbed the It Girl after her starring role in the film It, 1927, Bow embodied the spirit of the flapper era with her vibrant sexuality, bobbed hair, and unrestrained energy on screen. At the height of her popularity, she received over 45,000 fan letters in a single month and was arguably the most recognizable female face in America. Bow represented something revolutionary in female screen presence, explained a film historian specializing in the silent era. Before Bow, most leading ladies projected a kind of ethereal femininity, beautiful but somehow distant and untouchable. Clara brought an earthy, uninhibited quality to her performances that audiences, particularly working-class viewers, found both authentic and liberating. She moved like a real person rather than a posed figure in a painting. She laughed with her whole body. She conveyed desire without apology or artifice. This authentic screen presence was rooted in Bow's own background as the child of poverty in Brooklyn, where she had endured a traumatic childhood with a mentally ill mother who had once threatened to kill her and a father who was frequently absent. Unlike many stars of the era, who cultivated personas of refined elegance, Bow never entirely concealed her working-class origins, an authenticity that endeared her to audiences even as it made studio executives and social elites uncomfortable. What Hollywood never fully understood about Bow was that her appeal wasn't despite her Brooklyn background, but partially because of it, noted the cultural analyst. She represented possibility, the idea that a girl from the tenements could transform into a glamorous star without sacrificing her essential vitality and authenticity. It made her relatable in ways that more manufactured stars could never achieve. But this same quality made her difficult to control within a system increasingly concerned with presenting a sanitized vision of stardom. As the 1920s transitioned into the 1930s, Bow's unrestrained personality and lifestyle began to clash with changing social attitudes and the film industry's growing preoccupation with at least the appearance of moral propriety. The flapper era that had embraced sexual freedom and rebellion against Victorian constraints was giving way to the more conservative values of the Depression era, creating a cultural environment increasingly hostile to Bow's uninhibited public image. The transition from silent to sound films coincided with this cultural shift, creating a perfect storm for Bow, said the historian. While she successfully made the transition to talkies, her distinctive Brooklyn accent actually adding to her authentic screen presence rather than detracting from it, the changing moral climate made her particular brand of open sexuality increasingly problematic for studios concerned with avoiding controversy. This professional vulnerability coincided with a period of intense personal challenges for Bow. Years of working at a punishing pace had taken a physical and emotional toll. Like her mother, she began experiencing symptoms of mental illness, including insomnia, anxiety, and what would now likely be diagnosed as bipolar disorder. Without appropriate medical support, she attempted to manage these symptoms through alcohol and other substances, creating additional problems that further complicated her already precarious professional position. What happened to Bow as these pressures mounted was one of Hollywood's most brutal examples of abandonment, observed the cultural analyst. The same industry that had profited enormously from her natural vitality and sexual charisma now treated those qualities as liabilities rather than assets. When she began to struggle under the combined weight of mental health issues, exhaustion, and the transition to a new film era, the support system that should have protected such a valuable star simply evaporated. This abandonment took its most public form through the tabloid press, which began publishing increasingly sensational stories about Bow's personal life, mental health struggles, and alleged sexual behavior. Most notorious was a series of articles in the Coast Reporter, a scandal sheet published by Frederick Girnow, which made outrageous claims about Bow's sex life, including allegations of bestiality and relationships with USC football players. While these claims were largely fabricated, they created a cloud of scandal around Bow that the studios proved unwilling to counter with any meaningful support. The contrast between the industry's treatment of male and female stars facing personal crises was stark and revealing, noted the historian. Male stars like John Barrymore could engage in public drunkenness and sexual excess while still receiving studio protection and continued employment. Bow's similar behaviors, rather than being managed or concealed by the publicity department, became justification for her professional abandonment. The double standard wasn't subtle, it was systematic and devastating. By 1933, Bow's once brilliant career had effectively ended. She made her final film, Hoopla, at the age of 28, an age when most actresses were just entering their prime. Following this final project, she retreated to a ranch in Nevada with her husband, Rex Bell, and largely withdrew from public life. Later attempts to return to acting were undermined by her continuing mental health challenges and the industry's complete lack of interest in rehabilitating a star they had once celebrated but now viewed as toxic. Bow's later years reveal the long-term human cost of the industry's disposable approach to talent, said the cultural analyst. She experienced multiple nervous breakdowns, underwent various treatments including shock therapy, and lived an increasingly isolated life. The vibrant young woman who had once embodied the joy and freedom of the Roaring Twenties spent decades in seclusion, her mental health permanently damaged by the combination of pre-existing vulnerabilities and the brutal treatment she had received at the hands of an industry that used her and then discarded her. When Bow died in 1965 at the age of 60, her obituaries treated her as a relic of a bygone era, rather than acknowledging her groundbreaking contributions to film acting and female representation on screen. The industry that had abandoned her in life showed little more interest in her in death, allowing her significant legacy to fade from public consciousness for decades before film historians began the important work of reclaiming her place as one of silent cinema's most influential performers. Clara Bow's story represents the particularly harsh fate that often awaited female stars who defied conventional expectations of femininity, concluded the historian. She wasn't just professionally abandoned, she was systematically destroyed by an industry that had profited from her natural exuberance and sexuality, but proved unwilling to protect her when those same qualities became liabilities rather than assets. Her tragedy wasn't just that her career ended prematurely, but that the authenticity that had made her so valuable became the justification for her complete disposability once cultural attitudes shifted.
Darling, promise me something.
Anything.
Don't ever leave me.
No, of course not.
16. Hedy Lamarr, the mind behind the beauty. When Hedy Lamarr arrived in Hollywood in 1938, she was instantly proclaimed the most beautiful woman in the world. The Austrian-born actress, who had already caused an international sensation with her controversial nude scene in the Czech film Ecstasy, 1933, possessed a classical beauty so striking that it seemed almost unreal. Perfect symmetrical features, luminous skin, and expressive eyes that the camera adored from any angle. Lamarr wasn't just beautiful, She was almost otherworldly in her physical perfection, explained a film historian specializing in European emigrants in Hollywood. From a purely visual perspective, she represented a kind of feminine ideal that transcended cultural boundaries. Studio executives who first encountered her reportedly fell silent in her presence, struck by a beauty that seemed almost impossible in its flawlessness. This extraordinary physical appearance proved both blessing and curse for Lamar. While it secured her immediate entry into Hollywood's star system, it also created a narrow professional identity that proved difficult to transcend. Studio publicity departments, particularly at MGM, where she was initially under contract, positioned her almost exclusively as a visual object, an exotic beauty to be gazed upon, rather than an actress with genuine talent and intelligence to be developed. What the studios never fully grasped about Lamar was that beneath the perfect exterior was one of the most remarkable minds in Hollywood, noted the cultural analyst. She wasn't just beautiful. She was brilliant in ways that the industry had no framework for recognizing or utilizing. The same woman being marketed solely for her appearance was a self-taught inventor and mathematician with extraordinary technical creativity that would eventually contribute significantly to modern telecommunications technology. This cognitive dissonance between Lamar's public image and her actual capabilities created a professional prison from which she struggled constantly to escape. While cast in films like Algiers, Boomtown, and Samson and Delilah that showcased her beauty, she repeatedly sought roles that would allow her to demonstrate her considerable acting talent and intelligence. These efforts were consistently undermined by an industry that had categorized her exclusively as a visual attraction rather than a multidimensional performer. Lamar faced a particular kind of typecasting that was especially difficult to overcome, observed the historian. While many actors struggle against being associated with specific character types, Lamar was fighting something more fundamental: the reduction of her entire identity to her physical appearance. Every time she attempted to expand beyond the beautiful exotic template, the studio system pushed her firmly back into that narrow category, unwilling to risk the commercial asset they believed her beauty represented. As Lamar entered her 30s, this professional restriction coincided with Hollywood's notorious dismissal of aging actresses. Despite still being objectively beautiful by any reasonable standard, she began to experience the industry's brutal age discrimination, a system in which women were considered to have diminishing value with each passing year, particularly when their primary value had been assigned to their physical appearance rather than their talent or charisma. The abandonment of Lamar was gradual but relentless, said the cultural analyst. As newer, younger beauties emerged, the industry that had once celebrated her as the epitome of feminine perfection began to treat her as increasingly expendable. Roles became scarcer, and those that were offered tended to be pale imitations of her earlier successes, exotic temptresses with little psychological dimension or narrative importance. This professional marginalization occurred even as Lamar was making her most significant non-cinematic contribution to society. During World War II, deeply concerned about the Nazi threat and determined to aid the Allied effort, Lamar collaborated with composer George Antheil to develop and patent a frequency-hopping technology designed to prevent enemy forces from jamming torpedo guidance signals. This innovation, created by the woman Hollywood marketed solely as a beautiful face, eventually became foundational to modern technologies, including Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and cellular communications. The tragic irony of Lamar's career is that while she was being professionally discarded for the supposed crime of natural aging, she was simultaneously creating technological innovations that would eventually transform global communication, noted a technology historian familiar with her scientific contributions. The same industry that could see no value in her beyond her youthful appearance was completely blind to the extraordinary mind that represented her actual enduring value as a human being. By the 1950s, Lamar's film career had effectively ended. Though still striking in appearance, she had crossed the invisible boundary that Hollywood maintained for female stars, the point at which their perceived sexual attractiveness to male audiences was deemed to have diminished beyond commercial viability. Unlike male stars who were permitted to age into character roles or continued romantic leads opposite much younger actresses, Lamar found herself essentially expelled from the industry that had once celebrated her as its most perfect female specimen. What followed was a period of increasing isolation and difficulty, said the film historian. Having been valued almost exclusively for her appearance rather than her considerable intellectual gifts, Lamar struggled to find meaningful work or recognition once that appearance was deemed slightly less than perfect by Hollywood's impossible standards. The psychological impact of this rejection on someone with so much more to offer was predictably devastating. In her later years, Lamar's life took increasingly troubling turns. Financial difficulties, failed marriages, and legal problems created headlines that focused on her as a fallen star rather than the multifaceted human being she actually was. Perhaps most painfully, her significant scientific contributions remained largely unrecognized during her lifetime, with her frequency-hopping patent having expired before the technology achieved its most widespread applications. The final indignity for Lamar was the industry's posthumous attempt to reclaim her as an icon while continuing to ignore the complexity of her actual identity, observed the cultural analyst. After her death in 2000, Hollywood was happy to celebrate her as a beautiful image from its golden past, while still largely overlooking both her intelligence and the systematic way it had discarded her once she aged beyond its narrow parameters of acceptability for women. It was abandonment followed by convenient historical revisionism. Only in recent years has a more complete picture of Lamar emerged, with books, documentaries, and scholarly work finally acknowledging her remarkable dual legacy as both film star and scientific innovator. This belated recognition, while valuable for historical accuracy, came far too late to benefit Lamar herself, a woman whose true value had been consistently overlooked by an industry capable of seeing only her surface rather than her substance. Lamar's story reveals perhaps the most fundamental form of Hollywood abandonment, concluded the historian. She wasn't just abandoned when her career faltered or when scandal emerged. She was abandoned in a more profound sense by an industry that refused to recognize or utilize her complete humanity. By reducing her solely to her appearance, Hollywood not only limited her career, but participated in the tragic waste of extraordinary talents that extended far beyond the camera's frame. It's a form of abandonment that continues to affect women in the entertainment industry to this day.
Here, if you don't, I'm going to... Wait, my foot. My foot is...
17. Marie McDonald, the body who lost her mind. In the 1940s, Marie McDonald embodied a particular type of post-war glamour. Nicknamed the Body for her hourglass figure and striking physical appearance, McDonald represented the kind of manufactured starlet that the studio system excelled at creating. Beautiful, photographically perfect, and carefully positioned to catch the public's attention through a combination of physical attributes and strategic publicity. McDonald was very much a product of the system, explained a film historian specializing in contract players of the 1940s. Unlike some stars who brought distinctive talents or personalities to their careers, McDonald was essentially shaped from the ground up by studio publicists who recognized her physical appeal and built a public identity around it. The Body wasn't just a nickname, it was her entire professional persona, a marketing concept rather than a multi-dimensional artistic identity. This manufactured quality to McDonald's fame created particular vulnerabilities. Without a foundation of significant acting talent or a distinctive screen presence beyond her physical appearance, her professional standing depended almost entirely on continued public interest in the carefully constructed image that publicists had created. This made her especially susceptible to the industry's brutal disposability when that image began to generate the wrong kind of attention. McDonald's relationship with fame became increasingly desperate as the 1940s gave way to the 1950s, noted the cultural analyst. Without the artistic satisfaction or professional security that comes from genuine creative achievement, she began to view publicity of any kind as essential to her continued relevance. This desperation would eventually lead to decisions that transformed her from asset to liability in Hollywood's cold commercial calculation. The most notorious of these decisions came in January 1957, when McDonald reported to police that she had been kidnapped from her home, driven to the desert, and abandoned. The story generated massive media attention, with McDonald providing detailed accounts of her alleged abduction and mistreatment. However, inconsistencies in her story quickly emerged, and investigators became increasingly skeptical of her claims. The alleged kidnapping appeared to be an elaborate publicity stunt, said a criminal historian familiar with famous Hollywood cases. While McDonald maintained for years that the kidnapping was genuine, the evidence strongly suggested that she had orchestrated the entire episode as a means of generating media attention at a time when her career was fading. If this was indeed her plan, it backfired spectacularly, transforming her from minor celebrity to industry pariah virtually overnight. The backlash was swift and merciless. Studios that might previously have considered McDonald for supporting roles now viewed her as toxic, someone whose personal behavior had crossed the line from colorful to criminal. The publicity machinery that had created and sustained her career now turned against her, portraying her as mentally unstable and professionally unreliable. Opportunities that had already been diminishing now disappeared entirely. What made McDonald's situation particularly tragic was that beneath the publicity-seeking behavior were genuine mental health challenges that the industry had no interest in addressing, observed the cultural analyst. There's considerable evidence that she struggled with depression, anxiety, and possibly bipolar disorder, conditions that were poorly understood and heavily stigmatized in the 1950s. Rather than receiving appropriate medical support, she was simply labeled difficult and discarded. This professional abandonment coincided with escalating personal problems. Multiple marriages failed, financial difficulties mounted, and McDonald's reliance on alcohol and prescription medications increased as other support systems disappeared. The industry that had created the body now watched with detached disinterest as the human being behind that marketing concept spiraled into increasingly desperate circumstances. McDonald's later attempts to revive her career revealed just how completely Hollywood had abandoned her, said the historian. She would take virtually any opportunity for public attention: nightclub appearances, exploitative B-movies, tabloid interviews where she would discuss her personal problems in exchange for momentary visibility. It was a painful display of someone trying to cling to a professional identity that the industry had already determined was no longer commercially viable. In October 1965, McDonald staged another publicity stunt, calling the police to report a prowler while arranging to be found nude hiding in the bushes near her Los Angeles home. This incident, which generated brief tabloid attention but no career revival, highlighted her increasingly desperate attempts to recapture public interest through scandal rather than achievement, a strategy that reflected both her psychological distress and her accurate understanding that the industry now valued her only as a potential source of controversial headlines rather than as a performer. McDonald's final years were marked by continuing struggles with substance abuse and mental health issues, with brief attempts at recovery repeatedly undermined by the absence of sustainable professional opportunities or emotional support systems. On October 21, 1965, she was found dead in her home at the age of 42. The cause was determined to be an accidental overdose of Percodan, a prescription painkiller she had been taking following a recent surgery. McDonald's death received significantly less attention than her fabricated kidnapping had generated years earlier, noted the cultural analyst. The industry that had abandoned her in life showed little more interest in her in death. Brief obituaries mentioned her nickname and summarized her minor film appearances, but there was little recognition of either her one-time popularity or the systematic way in which she had been discarded once her marketable image became complicated by human frailty. What makes McDonald's story particularly relevant to the theme of Hollywood abandonment is how completely she was defined and then destroyed by a publicity system over which she ultimately had little control. Created as the body rather than developed as a multifaceted talent, she was left with few resources, professional, financial, or psychological, when that one-dimensional identity lost its commercial appeal. Her increasingly desperate publicity stunts, while self-destructive, represented a disturbingly accurate understanding of an industry that valued her only as a marketable image rather than as a human being deserving of support during evident psychological distress. Marie McDonald's tragedy wasn't just that she was abandoned when her career faltered, concluded the historian. It's that she was never really seen as anything more than a temporary commodity from the beginning, a manufactured product with a limited shelf life rather than an artist deserving of development and support. When that product no longer generated the desired return, the industry that had created it simply moved on to newer models, leaving the human being behind the body to navigate her considerable personal challenges without the support system that might have led to recovery rather than continued decline and premature death.
I can only give you love, forever, and a promise to be near.
18. Dorothy Dandridge, the barrier breaker left behind. Dorothy Dandridge's story represents one of Hollywood's most profound tragedies, a tale of extraordinary talent, groundbreaking achievement, and ultimately, complete abandonment by the very industry she had helped to transform. As the first African-American woman nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress for her performance in Carmen Jones, 1954, Dandridge broke barriers that many had considered permanently fixed in the racist structure of mid-century American entertainment. What Dandridge accomplished can't be overstated, explained a film historian specializing in racial representation in classic Hollywood. In an era when most black performers were limited to servant roles, comic relief, or musical numbers that could be cut for Southern audiences, Dandridge fought her way to legitimate leading lady status. She wasn't just talented, she was revolutionary, forcing an industry built on racial exclusion to acknowledge, however briefly and reluctantly, that a black woman could be a genuine movie star. This revolutionary quality was evident from Dandridge's earliest appearances in Hollywood. With her extraordinary beauty, refined elegance, and genuine acting talent, she defied the racist stereotypes that had defined black female representation on screen. Studio executives and audiences accustomed to seeing African-American women portrayed as maids, mammies, or exotic primitives were confronted instead with a performer who embodied sophisticated glamour and emotional complexity. Dandridge deliberately positioned herself as a direct challenge to Hollywood's racial hierarchy, noted the cultural analyst. She refused roles that perpetuated demeaning stereotypes, even when this meant losing desperately needed income. She invested in voice training, movement coaching, and other refinements that would make her impossible to dismiss as anything less than a complete, accomplished actress. She understood that her career wasn't just about personal achievement, but about creating possibilities for other black performers who would follow. This determination led to her groundbreaking performance as Carmen Jones, an achievement that forced the industry to confront its own systemic racism when her undeniable excellence resulted in an Oscar nomination. For a brief moment, it appeared that Dandridge might have permanently expanded Hollywood's narrow conception of who could be a leading lady, that her talent had created a breach in the color barrier that could never again be fully repaired. What happened after Dandridge's nomination reveals the depth of Hollywood's resistance to meaningful racial progress, said the historian. Rather than opening doors to a variety of complex, dramatically rich roles, her historic achievement was followed by one of the most complete and cruel instances of industry abandonment in film history. The studios that had briefly celebrated her now had no idea what to do with a black actress of her caliber, and rather than develop appropriate projects, they simply stopped calling. This professional abandonment took a particularly painful form for Dandridge. Having established herself as a sophisticated leading lady, she refused to accept the demeaning stereotypical roles that represented the only consistent work available to black actresses of the era. But the industry proved unwilling to create or cast her in roles that matched her demonstrated talents. The result was a devastating catch-22. Either accept work that undermined everything she had fought to achieve, or face unemployment and financial ruin. The only roles offered to Dandridge after her nomination were variations of the exotic primitive, hypersexualized characters that reinforced, rather than challenged, racist stereotypes, explained the cultural analyst. After fighting so hard to be recognized as a serious actress, rather than a racial caricature, she now faced the soul-crushing realization that Hollywood had no interest in her as anything other than a temporary novelty, a black woman who could be briefly celebrated as an exception before being firmly returned to her proper place in the industry's racial hierarchy. This professional crisis coincided with devastating personal challenges for Dandridge. A series of failed relationships, financial mismanagement by business advisors, and increasing reliance on alcohol and prescription medications to manage her depression created a downward spiral from which recovery became increasingly difficult. The industry that had briefly elevated her now watched with indifference as she struggled with both professional and personal devastation. By the early 1960s, Dandridge's situation had become truly desperate, noted the historian. Despite her Oscar nomination just a few years earlier, she was facing bankruptcy, foreclosure on her home, and such complete professional abandonment that she was eventually forced to accept a role in a B-movie made in Mexico. one of the very kinds of parts she had fought so hard to transcend. The psychological impact of this reversal on someone who had briefly touched the highest levels of industry recognition was predictably devastating. On September 8th, 1965, Dandridge was found dead in her West Hollywood apartment at the age of 42. The official cause was listed as an accidental overdose of the antidepressant imipramine. She died with less than $2 in her bank account, a shocking indication of how completely the industry had discarded a performer who had made Oscar history just 11 years earlier. What makes Dandridge's abandonment particularly cruel is the element of false promise, observed the cultural analyst. For a brief, shining moment, Hollywood allowed her to believe that genuine talent could overcome systemic racism, that excellence would be rewarded regardless of color. Her subsequent treatment revealed this to be a devastating lie. Her Oscar nomination hadn't represented meaningful progress, but rather a temporary, isolated exception that the industry had no intention of developing into sustained opportunity for her or other black performers. The tragedy of Dandridge's abandonment extends beyond her personal suffering to include the broader impact on film history and racial representation. Her brief success had hinted at the possibilities for more diverse and authentic portrayal of black women on screen. Her subsequent rejection reinforced the message that such possibilities remained firmly closed, regardless of talent or achievement, a message that would continue to limit opportunities for generations of performers of color. Dandridge died believing she had failed, said the historian. The reality is that Hollywood failed her, and in doing so, failed itself and its audience. Her abandonment wasn't just personally tragic, but represented a deliberate turning away from the more inclusive, artistically rich industry that might have developed had her breakthrough been supported rather than suppressed. It's a loss that can never be fully calculated in either human or cultural terms. In the decades following her death, Dandridge has been posthumously recognized as a pioneering figure who challenged Hollywood's racial barriers at enormous personal cost. This belated acknowledgement, while important for historical accuracy, came far too late to benefit Dandridge herself. A woman who died believing that her extraordinary achievements had ultimately amounted to nothing in an industry determined to maintain its rigid racial hierarchies regardless of individual talent or popular recognition. Dorothy Dandridge's story represents perhaps the most profound form of Hollywood abandonment, concluded the cultural analyst. She wasn't just abandoned as an individual performer, but as a symbol of possibilities that the industry actively chose to reject. In discarding her after her historic achievement, Hollywood made clear that maintaining its racist structures was more important than embracing the artistic and commercial potential of genuine inclusion. It's a choice whose consequences continue to reverberate through film history. A betrayal not just of one extraordinarily talented woman, but of the more equitable and creatively rich industry that might have emerged had her breakthrough been embraced rather than systematically erased.